Thank you for joining us. Q&A, it is Thursday night, and this is live. And we want you to be able to take part as usual, be able to make that email live@revelationtv.com, and also the text, the number for the SMS there was coming up on your screen. Don't ask me to read it because I'm dyslexic. I'll put you down the wrong path. Don't want to do that. My usual co-host is with me tonight, Mark Willats. Thank you, Mark.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, real privilege. You're going to like tonight. In fact, all of us are going to like tonight because we have Nick Szkiler who's with us. Nick, welcome to Revelation TV Studios.
Thank you very much.
Nick, just in a sentence, just to whet the appetites of our viewers, tell us what you're going to be sharing tonight, and then also like to know a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a Christian businessman from Yorkshire, felt impassioned about the current crisis, constitutional crisis in our government, and felt that insofar as I could do anything, I needed to do what I could, and that was to make a very short mini documentary in Malton, the town where I live, and I was a bit overwhelmed, I guess, and astonished by the amount of hits it's had, and indeed the comments and lively debate that has encouraged. Now, this video has only just been out a couple of weeks, right? Yes. And already had 80,000 or something? 63,000 as of tonight. It was, I finished the editing of it and loaded it up on at 11 o'clock, not last Sunday, the Sunday before. Okay, well, we're going to look at it in a minute because it is so well produced, and may I say you did a great job as also in presenting it, Nick. So, and it's very clear for people, you know, to simply understand some of our history, which is important. We'll be looking at some of those people that have really contributed in the past and had almost a prophetic look into the future of where we're at today. And when we're talking about Brexit. Now, let's just have a little bit of your background. I know you're a Yorkshireman. Yes, a Yorkshireman with a very mixed heritage. My late father was a Pole, actually of Ukrainian origin. Mum was English, and so I've got a bit of French, Ukrainian, Polish, English, Prussian, and Jewish in my family, so I'm kind of a European. Quite well-rounded, then. You could say that. Okay, for a Westerner. Yeah. Right. Nick, just give an introduction to the video, because I think the video just has to be something which people are going to really respond to. So yeah. Just an introduction for it. Well, it's essentially a look back at some of the prophetic words that came from some of our statesmen politicians of the past, principally Enoch Powell, who, of course, was much maligned as a racist in his day, and also Tony Benn, from opposite ends of the political spectrum, but speaking to us today across over 40 years, their predictions about the future were astonishingly accurate. So I refer to them, I let them speak for themselves, and then I try to, really in a language that everybody can understand, not in Westminster Politico speech, but actually in everybody's language, to help them to understand really how huge a crisis this is in Britain. This is a punctuation mark in Britain's history, and also I and many other people believe a really epic moment for the rest of the Western world. Mm-hmm. Right, well, let's have a look at the video. That's going to come on right now, and be ready to, during this, to send in your emails and texts also with questions that you want to ask Nick. Have a look at this. Well, this is the market town of Malton in North Yorkshire, self-styled food capital of the county. Here in this square, markets have been held for centuries. Just a few hundred yards from here is a livestock market where farmers bring their animals to sell, usually about once a month. It was food production and a common agricultural policy that were at the foundation of an argument for a European economic community going right back to the Treaty of Rome in 1957. Now, I'm 64 years old, and that makes me one of the youngest British citizens to have been able to vote in the first referendum on the EEC in 1975. The whole thrust of the argument at that time was about commerce and trade, food prices, a common market, and also figuring in people's minds was the fact that some 30 years after the end of the Second World War, we wanted continued peace in Europe. That was vital to the interests of the nation.
Now, if at the time we'd been told that there was a subplot, a hidden agenda, if you like, to create a European superstate in which Britain would be relegated to little more than the status of a province within a United States of Europe, we would never have voted for entry. There is no question that the people would not have voted to lose that level of sovereignty. I was born here in Yorkshire. My father was an Allied soldier, a Pole, who came here towards the end of the war, decided to stay. Many of these soldiers were allowed to settle in Britain because they'd fought so hard for the Allied cause. And he met my Yorkshire-born mother. The early 1950s was a period of austerity in Britain, and indeed there was rationing in the early years, but it was a period of great optimism. Britain was trying very hard to build a better future for the next generation, and there was a serious determination never to allow a conflict to arise in Europe again. Over the past 70 years, Britain has accepted migrants from many different parts of the world: Afro-Caribbeans, Asians, and Eastern Europeans like my father. And they came here with one thing in common. They all wanted to work hard and settle and raise families in a country whose values and freedoms and prosperity they admired and wanted to be part of. It's a matter of indisputable historical fact that those values and freedoms which we enjoy in this nation were based on the Judeo-Christian faith of our ancestors. Many of our household name great companies, our institutions, charities, our system of law and order and government were all based on that faith. Our ability to exercise our democratic right to change governments and to change policies has been the safety valve which kept Britain from the bloody revolution which happened elsewhere in Europe. I was privileged to be born in an era when free, high-quality education to grammar school and university level, as well as healthcare from the cradle to the grave, were the right of every British citizen. I understand the history and the sacrifices that were made so that my generation and those that would follow would continue to enjoy these wonderful rights and privileges. Sadly, in these more educationally deprived times, the young are less likely to understand the history. Many don't realise just how perilously close we are to losing our democratic birthright. The late and much misunderstood MP Enoch Powell, made infamous by his 1968 Rivers of Blood speech, was in fact one of the finest politicians of his day. Enoch Powell spoke 12 languages, spoke Latin by the age of 5, was the youngest ever professor in British history and the youngest brigadier in the army. He made this prophetic warning to the nation back in December 1976.
The British people are about to have practiced upon them a trick even cruder and more shameless than that by which they were cheated out of their inheritance of parliamentary self-government in the first place when we acceded to the European Economic Community. However, since the trick is basically the same one over again, it is to be hoped that the people will not be taken in twice, but will listen to those who warned them correctly before.
He was the first Eurosceptic. He was the first person who saw the European Union not as a common market, but as a political project. And in the general election of February 1974, he said he would not stand as a candidate in the election. And nobody could quite believe that a man who was not very far away perhaps from becoming a prime minister at one point wouldn't stand in the election. And he, 2 days before the general election, booked the City Hall in Birmingham, his home city, and gave a speech at which he said he urged British voters to vote for the Labour Party. Now, my parents just simply couldn't believe this. You know, how could the buttoned-up Conservative brigadier, you know, the darling of the right of British politics, advocate voting for a socialist party? But the reason was that the socialists said we could have a referendum on our common market membership. So a very highly principled man. And there was an amazing moment in that speech when somebody at the back of the room shouted at Powell, "Judas!" And he stared at the man and he pointed. He said, no, Judas was paid. I'm making a sacrifice. How about that?
The succeeding 4 decades have seen a continuing loss of sovereignty for Britain, particularly following the Maastricht and Lisbon treaties. A written constitution for the European Union had been planned as far back as 2004. Britain abandoned the idea of a vote on it after both France and the Netherlands rejected that constitution in 2 referendums. 2 years later, most of the constitution's provisions were resurrected in the Lisbon Treaty, a document which was as much of a threat to national sovereignty as the old text would have been. In one of his first major decisions as Prime Minister, Gordon Brown broke Mr. Blair's promise to hold a referendum on the new treaty. Ireland voted no, by 53% to 47%. Almost as soon as the Irish ballots were counted, their rejection of Lisbon was treated as the wrong answer. The cynical European political elite forced a second referendum on an Ireland still reeling from the fallout of the 2008 financial crisis so that they would come up with the right answer. Does that sound familiar?
Nigel and I agree on hardly anything at all. But we do agree at least on one thing, and it happens to be the most important thing, not only now, but in the lifetime of everyone in this hall and everyone in this country. It is the demand that Britain should be an independent, sovereign and democratic country, and that means leaving the European Union.
The last thing they have the slightest intention of doing is to permit Britain to resume her position as a world buyer and, incidentally, a world supplier. It is a question of the national existence and independence of Britain itself. The whole business of food prices and the common agricultural policy is a symbol and a specimen of the degradation of Britain from a nation to a province. We were threatened that we could not feed ourselves unless we gave up our freedom. The lesson which has been taught to the British electorate since it made its grave but recoverable mistake is that in small things and in great things alike, there is no future for the British people which they will find tolerable, except as a sovereign, self-governing nation-state.
So what question did you want to ask me?
What are you doing?
What am I doing? I'm making a programme about Brexit and about the choice that your parents and your grandparents are making about Britain's future, which is your future and the future of the children you'll have. And I'm amongst a group of people who believe that the decision that we make now is probably a once and for all decision which will affect you and the kind of country that you live in when you're as old as me. That's what this is about.
We could have expected them to be honourable and slightly better than that, couldn't we?
Well, one of the comments that I made in this little film is that it is our ability as a sort of in a democratic country, our ability to vote out a government and vote in new policies that have kept Britain from bloody revolution over the last few hundred years. And this is probably one of the most, it's a kind of light the blue touch paper moment.
Absolutely with you.
And I can imagine
so
how yeah, in fact, I've met middle-aged people, ladies who are, you know, really sort of quiet and gentle, who are more angry about this than anything that's happened in our nation in the whole of their lifetime. And, you know, can you imagine if we just voted in Labour and suddenly there was a 2 million strong petition to have the Conservatives back in, and the government said, well, we better have a rethink then, or maybe a best of 3. It would be anarchy. Anyway, thank you for your question. You won't be on ITN News tonight, so don't worry. The Brexit vote of June 2016 was the biggest vote for anything in Britain's history. More than 17 million people voted an unequivocal no. 73% of Britain's elected MPs, however, were Remainers. In an orchestrated 2-year-long fear and misinformation campaign, our government ably assisted by unelected EU commissioners and officials, have conspired together to rob the British people of this one opportunity to forge an independent destiny.
Can anyone but a fool seriously suppose that if the community, already thus equipped, is endowed with the authority derived from a body which directly represents the total electorate, the elective bodies of the member states will not shrink and shrivel under the spreading shade of a European Parliament, Commission and Council? That, starkly, is the difference between a nation and a province, between self-government and subordination. The choice between them, still open, still free, in no wise morally or legally preempted, is the choice your representatives will shortly be making in Parliament. You still have the power to punish them if you take it otherwise than as you wish, but you must tell them, and tell them now. No politician can restore to a nation a spirit which is lost, or a pride and personality which have departed from it. What politicians can do, if that spirit still exists, and that pride and personality are merely latent and not extinct, is to show the nation when the time to exert itself has arrived, and when the opportunity is present.
Now, the Canadians, who are relatively small on the northern frontiers of the United States, if they were to adopt this argument, would have joined the United States years ago. We have struggled, and we really have struggled for centuries, to win the right to hire and fire our lawmakers. And the day we give up that right and abandon the capacity to learn by our experience through the ballot box, to dismiss a Labour government and get a new government, or a Conservative government and get a new government, the day we do that, we build in an element in our society that I believe will destroy all that is most valuable in Britain. I want to work and cooperate with everybody, but I want to govern myself, and that's the key to it all. The people in Bristol have sent me to Parliament over 25 years, and you, I think, longer from your constituency. And every time they've had the power to dismiss me or to re-elect me, and because of that, I've had to listen to them. Now, the commissioners don't have to listen to the British people because they are immune from the possibility of electoral defeat. Now, on the continent, the traditions of democracy are different from ours. 30 years ago, Germany was under Hitler, Italy under Mussolini. France has had a succession of revolutions and counter-revolutions and coups d'etat. We, for many centuries, have fought for the right to give the ultimate power to our own people. Now, nobody can pretend, least of all you, because I know you have an idea of a political union, that's part of the European idea, can really argue that there isn't a price to be paid for this, and the price, unfortunately, is paid by the electors, whoever they elect in future elections will not be able to change the common agricultural policy, the common regional policy, because that has been adopted by a previous government and cannot be changed by a single nation, whichever government is elected.
Theresa May and her incompetent cohorts have failed to negotiate an orderly and dignified exit from the European Union. It's embarrassing that this once great global trading nation has been made a laughingstock in the international community. A negotiation which you can't walk away from isn't a negotiation at all. What many of us have observed as our hapless Prime Minister shuttles between Westminster and Brussels looks more like capitulation. So what's really going on? The gifted author, broadcaster and political commentator Melanie Phillips says it best. This is nothing less than a titanic clash between civilizations, between opposing worldviews. The first seeks to defend the Western nation based on its discrete and particular history, its culture, language, religion and ethical values which are drawn from the Hebrew Bible and from Christianity. A national identity which is expressed through laws passed by a democratically elected and sovereign parliament. The second wants to destroy all that and replace it with a new world order under which the Western nation is superseded by supranational laws and government, institutions where national borders are erased and biblical morality is replaced by an ideology, specifically identity politics, multiculturalism and moral relativism. Theresa May, the vicar's daughter, seeks a compromise. There cannot be a compromise between these two competing ideologies. Simply put, the one must defeat the other. How pathetic and weak Britain's political leadership now appears. Could you imagine our wartime Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, embarrassing the nation in this way? Securing Brexit, an exit from the European Union, as the majority of the electorate expect, is not about primarily migration, race, or indeed religious issues. It is about taking back the rights and freedoms which were hard won by our ancestors in these islands. That legacy to be passed on undiminished to our children and grandchildren. Whether you voted Leave or Remain, these past 2 years have demonstrated that our self-serving government and political elite are not worthy of the trust of the British electorate. If Brexit is not delivered in a way that leaves Britain independent and free, then the entire political class in this country can expect to reap a whirlwind at the next general election. Indeed, the old two-party system could very well be consigned to the history books. Treachery is defined as betrayal, disloyalty, faithlessness, breach of trust, duplicity, deception, false-heartedness, double-dealing, untrustworthiness. Treason is the crime of showing no loyalty to your country, especially by helping its enemies or trying to overthrow its government.
Delaying Brexit is an attempt to thwart Brexit. The people who are in favour of delay are people who were Remainers in the first place, and it is an effort to override the authority of 17.4 million voters.
It seems rather symbolic that on this last Saturday before March the 29th, as the traders are packing their wares after another day of trading, that the Union Jack over Malton should be hanging limply, faded and tattered. The question that people must answer is whether the supranational political elite, the unelected EU commissioners, the globalists with their tame broadcasters who are laughing behind our backs, are going to overcome the democratic will of our people. As Melanie Phillips says, without Winston Churchill's leadership in the Second World War, Britain would have fallen to the Nazis. But now Britain has no leadership to give its MPs the courage they would need to march away from the pharaohs of Brussels. The people, however, do have that courage. It may take a modern miracle to save Brexit now, and with it, the last slim chance of British participation in the epic battle to save the West. There will not be a more serious question in our lifetime. The answer to that question will shape the future for every British citizen. Our tiny island will once again prove to be the bulwark against which tyranny and enslavement will not prevail. May God save Britain.
So hopefully you've got lots of questions that are starting. I know some of them have started to come in, but Nick, you've done a brilliant job there, and also you brought a lot of things together here that we really need to have a bit more understanding on, and perhaps through the next hour we'll start to unravel some of that. Great to have those quotes from Enoch Powell, Tony Benn, and Roy Jenkins was a bit taken back there a bit, but you know, these are great men, and obviously Winston Churchill. But sadly, our young people don't know this, and they say, oh, it's only the older generation that are really wanting to come out of Europe. But there's a lot going on. Give us some of the tasters of some of the emails and questions that are coming up, please, Mark.
Great one here, just to start us off. John from Belfast. Good evening, gents. Brexit ongoing again. How does the current situation relate to the Bible, and what the future holds for us in the UK, Nick?
Well, it's a very interesting question, that, because although I'm not a great historian, I do understand that when in the 1920s, Britain accepted what under international law became a sacred trust of civilizations, that was to help the Jewish people have a national home. That was a huge event which we believe aligned up with history. Now, one of my colleagues, I think you know that I'm involved in a film trust called Hatikva.
Yeah.
I think he must have anticipated that wonderful question, because he sent me this. In April, called Stephen Briggs, and he said, in April 2018, Israel will celebrate 70 years of being restored physically as a nation in the land. We still pray for and support the rest of the dispersed Jewish people returning as is prophesied, but the vast majority are still in exile spiritually. After 70 years of spiritual exile, even within the land of promise, it's time for believers to make an effort to pray for the full restoration. Now, a quote, when 70 years have been completed, I'll visit you and fulfill my good word to you. You will seek me and find me. That's from Jeremiah 29:10. But Israel isn't the only nation who has a prophecy of God's restoration after 70 years.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think our viewers need to listen to what I've said here and test this for themselves, but part of Jeremiah's inspiration was presumably Isaiah's early prophecy about 70 years of exile for the foreign city of Tyre in Isaiah 23. It was the eastern hub of a maritime trading empire throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, as far west as Tarshish. For centuries, British theologians have suggested that Tarshish might have been an ancient name for the British Isles. The Isles are far off. The prophecy of Isaiah 69 about ships of Tarshish does appear to have been fulfilled over the last 150 years by the British Empire being the first to bring the Jewish people home. So, obviously, we can't say conclusively that that's it, but it's very interesting that this tiny nation, which geographically is so small, should have given the world its primary language, it's the mother of all parliaments, and that it should have been the nation, really, that was entrusted to begin the restoration of what we now see as the Jewish national home. So it's a controversial view, but I personally believe that a big part of this current Titanic fight that's going on is to allow Britain to have sufficient freedom of foreign policy that in a time of increasing anti-Semitism, we would be able to stand in some way with a Jewish state. Mm. So I separate my support for, I always think of this as being a supporter for the Lord's eternal purposes for Israel, rather than every machination of a secular Israeli government, but that's how I see it.
This isn't actually a biblical situation that I'm going to bring up, but it does point to the time that we're living in and the days that we're facing and the problems we're having trying to reconcile the polarized views and perhaps the people behind and pulling the strings knew all along, because a document that you got to look at pointed some 30 years ago to where we are today. And what you were sharing during watching that video, I'd like you to share with our viewers. They're staggering at this information.
Well, this is something actually that prior to making the film I hadn't a clue about. I knew that there had been a sort of conspiracy in the government of the early 1970s to keep the full extent of potential future loss of sovereignty away from the British people. But it was one of the wonderful contributors to the YouTube video. Just people were sending me stuff. And one particular guy sent me a PDF of a document which is called FCO 30-1048. And what this is, it is a document that was classified in 1971, so it predates our membership of the EEC. And what it represents is the Foreign and Commonwealth officers' advice to the government on how to handle the issues that would arise. It included legal advice, etc., etc. And that document, which the viewers are now seeing, in the small grey square you can see on the bottom right, it actually says that it closed until, and the date is 2002. So from 71 to 2002, that was locked up in a vault. Any of the viewers who want to now go and go to the National Archives and get their white gloves on can examine that. I provided you a full 232-page PDF of it earlier. But it says this, and the British, whichever side of Brexit people were on, I think if this was revealed, they would be utterly shocked that one of the conditions for joining the European Economic Community, and there were good reasons, trade and economy-wise, to do it, was one of the things they pointed out to government in government advice was you're going to have to lose the coal industry. You're going to have to lose your steel industry. You're going to have to open up your waters to international fisheries. And there was a whole raft of things. And whoever was doing the briefing was extremely careful to say, when it gets to sovereignty, be careful how you deal with this. And what you're going to have to do is, you're going to have to give the people a semblance of democracy by letting them have a European, delegates at European Parliament. But the truth is, they are, and have been, always powerless. A European Member of Parliament can't introduce a new piece of legislation. He can only vote on something that's put before him. By who? By unelected European commissioners. Now, some of the viewers, as long in the tooth as me, will be able to remember a British cabinet minister called Peter Lilly. And Peter Lilly, some years ago, proposed this amazingly funny bill, an early day bill, in which he was saying that all MPs' salaries should be reduced, commensurate with their level of responsibility. And he said quite clearly, when I was a cabinet minister, so often I'd want to do something, and a Mandarin would come up to him and say, well, I'm sorry, Minister, that falls within the exclusive competence of the European Union. And he said colleagues of his, ministers, would be passionate about something and then find out, actually, they couldn't do anything about it because European regulations had primacy over British statute law. And he said they'd then come back and have to endorse it in Parliament. And I loved his phrase. He said, claiming paternity rather than impotence, the fate of the cuckold throughout history. What a lovely comment.
The ball piece.
Yeah. So was he not, Powell, also saying something about the betrayal of the British people? And could this tie in with this? What's in this? Was this document that was laid dormant or locked up for 30 years?
I think it would be fair to say that it was made clear, to an extent, that there would be some loss of sovereignty in the early 70s. It was the extent of it and the sort of, we were only given the tip of a very big iceberg that was under the surface. And so, I was born in 55, so I was amongst the youngest who were able to vote. And I can remember the argument that it was about trade. And remember that Britain had really suffered in the late, it was still paying off the Lend-Lease debt to the United States at that
war loans.
War loans. And so we were in a bit of a bad state. And so the idea of this wonderful common market, which I still believe was a way to go, people supported it. The thing was, we weren't told that it would lead to a loss of sovereignty, not just in Britain, but in every country that is represented in the European Union. And one of the reasons why, I think anyway, this battle has become so emotive, and it's not something you've probably seen on news bulletins, but 13% of the population of the European Union, of the economic power of the European Union is, population is Britain. 16% is Germany. But when you compare the economic output, and Germany, we are the principal trading partner of Germany, you take the British contribution to the European Union out, and it's the effect of losing 19 other countries. That's how big this is. Mm-hmm. So imagine so they're being completely deluded if they think this won't make a difference. Yeah. It's like an EU 28 going down to 9. Yeah.
Well, in actual fact, they mentioned it today in the news, didn't they? They talked about the fact, and it was the first time I'd heard this mentioned, that it's the EU who are also going to fare badly. It's not just us, though, that the scaremongering about, the loss of trade and people's income and the well-being is going to deteriorate greatly. But the loss of us not being in there in the EU will actually be detrimental to the whole of the EU, financially, of course.
And in another way, which people haven't really thought about, there's this, and I'm not an expert, I'm not a politician, so I'm not an expert on the detail of this, but there is a mechanism by which, I think if you have 35% of the population, therefore there's certain things you can block. And so Germany, together with Britain and France, and a couple of other, I think with the Netherlands involved as well, they can outvote some things which some of the German politicians call the Club Med countries. And what this means, Britain's exit from the EU, means that states which are actually, in terms of economic activity, are failing, will have access to EU coffers unhindered by the bloc, which Britain and the other major powers could have prevented. So that's a big deal. That's a dose of realism coming to the European Union.
I've got to say that one of the things that gets poo-pooed a lot when you're listening to the media is that sovereignty is a weak thing to be worried about. It's not something that's to be taken seriously by those who want to remain, and they can't understand why people, you know, that want to leave harp on about what, you know, so define what loss of sovereignty is for us, or for, in your perception.
Well, I'm not going to extend my myself by giving you a legal definition of sovereignty, but for me, it's the ability of a nation's people. And remember that in Britain, the power has, for hundreds of years, been devolved to the people. It is the power of the people to make policy, to make laws, to change, basically to decide on the future and the destiny of their country. And it's that which has gradually been diminished. Now, that's not so much observable to the younger people, for the obvious reason that it's the world they grew up in. But let me give you just one specific example of what loss of sovereignty means in my little life. So in 1989, I decided I wanted to have a go at becoming a pilot. And I did my training over the Selby coalfield. If you look at the M62 from the air, there are 3 big power stations: Drax, Ferrybridge and Eggborough. Between them, they collectively produced, when they were all coal-fired, 14% of all the electricity for the United Kingdom. What has happened now is that huge plantations of biomass are being grown in the United States, in Canada, in Portugal, in Latvia, to be brought across on diesel-powered ships, to be unloaded by diesel-powered machines at our docks, brought on trains and trucks, to be burned to generate electricity over the Selby coalfield. We can trace that right back to that document from 1971 that said, you'll have no coal.
Right, yeah.
Unbelievably stupid, but we don't have the sovereign power to change that.
Yeah. Right. Outrageous, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay, so sovereignty, let me put it another way. What are some of the things that you want to leave the EU that are perhaps some of the other points which are brought up, like, you know, being able to control the immigration, because obviously that's something which you levied against you, you're racist and things like this.
Yeah, well, that's, I mean, I've had to endure 1 or 2 quite challenging comments about this, but obviously this isn't about race. I mean, I declared at the beginning of the film, I'm the son of an immigrant. You know, I studied with Indians. I have friends who are from many nations. This is about what I would promote is you know, integration as peoples, but not to have laws and regulate. I mean, I'll give you an example. Moses was given how many commandments?
10.
10. Well, a friend told me that there are 22,000 different regulations and rules related to, from the EU, relating to the growing distribution and retailing of cabbages.
Oh, right, really? Okay.
On.
Yeah.
So what I would look, I mean, as I've said before, I'm not a politician, but imagine a set of arrangements in which Britain continued to have access to that wonderful free market in Europe, because we all enjoy the wonderful relationships that we have in Europe, in business. I have relationships in business in Europe and in India. But in terms of migration, and this is a very emotive subject, why couldn't it be that, because we need our so many overseas workers in the NHS, we need, you know, Poles, Slovaks, Latvians, we need them, but why couldn't they be, you know, be sponsored by an employer to come over? If it was my decision, I'd be granting full citizenship to every migrant that is here now from Europe, provided there was a reciprocal arrangement, and I can't see a problem with that. You know, we are a nation of foreigners. You know, if you look at British history, we're united colours of Benetton and always have been. It's the uncontrolled access of people to come into the nation to get social and welfare benefits rather than to come here to work that I think is the issue for many of the people who voted Remain. Right. Sorry, voted Leave.
Yeah. Emails are starting to come in, guys. Evening, everyone. Former Conservative MP Anne Widdecombe recently said, quote, "We've got the worst Prime Minister since Anthony Eden, we've got the worst leader of the opposition in the entire history of the Labour Party, and we've got the worst Parliament since Oliver Cromwell, and they've been given the task of delivering Brexit." I agree to that. Nick, what do you think on this current inhabitants of number 10?
I've got a great deal of time for Anne Widdecombe, and I think we have to be very careful what we say when we're generalising about this. There are some brilliant and gifted politicians in our government. Many of them, one particular chap who is an MP, who I got a comment of his on the responses. You know, an ex-Royal Air Force man, you know, with a great career, highly intellectual. The problem is that the whip system means that many of these MPs are now wrestling with their conscience. And we could very well see, for example, in the Conservative Party, a number of our members of Parliament, you know, resign the whip, because it's such a thing. You know, they know that the electorate said out. They didn't say out if, they said out. And so it's put them in a very difficult position. As for the leadership, I have to say to you that I believe that they are in the grip of the globalists. I believe that this is a stitch-up. And one of the things which I think it's not difficult to prove when you look at the language of it, we know that a big part of the withdrawal agreement was written in Chancellor Merkel's department, by her people. And that says a huge... because they are absolutely adamant that they're going to use every possible mechanism, however many votes it takes, to get people to have a watered-down Brexit. And a watered-down Brexit isn't a Brexit at all. So there was a phrase, I think, from the First World War, lions led by sheep. I think that sums it up, really, at the moment. It is the most weak political leadership, I think, well, certainly I've seen in a lifetime.
So what do you know about Germany and Angela Merkel? I mean, they seem to be very quiet. I mean, and yet they have, I would say, probably the most to lose, the Germans, if we don't have a deal.
Well, there's a political party branded as being extremely right-wing in Germany, and they are trying very hard to get the facts known, but it's almost like there's a media conspiracy of silence. The reality is what I've described it as, but it's like there's this sense of, you know, all the stops out now that we are going to push this through. So I was in Germany actually about 6 months ago in a place called Eisleben, which is where Martin Luther was born. And I remember, some of the viewers would be shocked to hear this, I was on my knees, actually, in front of 150 Germans, actually saying how sorry I was as a Brit for what happened at Leipzig and at Dresden in the beginning of '45. You know, a merciless annihilation of hundreds of thousands of people for no military advantage. But people were saying to me over there, we're praying for you, we believe that Britain can do this. And should do this. This is about not just
come out of the EU.
Yeah, to come out of the EU.
I just want to make sure that's the right.
Exactly, and but they were saying it's not just for your sake. There was a Frenchman who put a post on this afternoon. I am French and pro-Frexit. if you, the oldest and strongest democracy, surrender to the EU, we are done. Never give in, never, 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 said Winston Churchill.
Wow.
That's a powerful comment from a Frenchman.
Yeah.
Emails, text.
OK, got one here from Debs. Hi, Howard and all. Great show, thanks. Let's just leave now with no deal and encourage and promote everyone to buy British. If we stay in the EU, we would lose the pound by Christmas. We don't want a police state telling us how to live individually, so why would we want to stay in a politically powerful, corrupt, larger type which coerces and controls collectively? Bye-bye to the regular EU, as you've been awful. I mean, we have to make it clear, it's not Europeans that we're trying to extricate ourselves from. Europe is a beautiful place. Absolutely. But this is the spiritual ideas and spiritual connotations that lie behind it, which are extremely dark. And to the average person listening to LBC or watching the 9 o'clock news, you'll never, ever be given those sort of insights into what this is about. This is biblical, and this is spiritual, isn't it, Nick?
It absolutely is. And if you remember the scripture, I think it's Jeremiah 6:16, which says, stand at the crossroads, and we're at the crossroads, and look at the old paths, the godly ways, where the good way is, and then you will find rest for your souls. But you said, we will not walk in it. I think we're in a Jeremiah 6:16 moment.
I think we are. Got one here from Mike from Coventry. This is a spiritual battle, and it is a battle that an independent UK must win. The stark option is God's side or man's side, full stop. And that is from Mike.
Yeah. I think that it's fair to say that we've gone beyond now the point where it's a, are you a leaver or are you a remainer? This is actually at its heart. This is now a fight for democracy, and I think most reasonable people, even if they were remainers, if they look and go down the rabbit hole that I've been down to look at what's there, they will be so shocked. They would have to say, we need to have a different system of government in our country, or we need to have a totally different government that actually does what it says. And you know,
people's faith in democracy has got to be harmed right now, because they're seeing that they're not really being truly represented by their elected politicians, and this has got to be very damaging to the process of what they're seeing through Brexit. And I just think you know, what's going to happen in 6 months' time? You know, where are we going to do it? Are people going to vote again? Are they going to... I'd hate to see a revolution, but I mean, do you think if it doesn't go right, do you think this is a possibility?
Well, I'm going to be very careful what I say here, because I think I said enough in the film that this is a light the blue touch paper moment. It didn't get reported very much in the media, but last Friday I was in Parliament Square with thousands and thousands and thousands of people. There were quite a few young, but there were lots of grey hairs, and there were lots of people with walking sticks, and there were lots of, from every strata, I would say, of our society. They were quietly, they were quietly protesting at what was happening in the building across the road in Parliament. And you know, the press did not really take full account of what was going on. It was very small as far as the press was concerned, but actually there were many thousands, and they sang at the end. They sang a hymn at the end of it. That wasn't reported in the press. But I think the point that you're making, that's evidenced by many of the comments I've received on the film. I will never vote on anything again if this doesn't happen, have said quite a lot of people. And it will leave us in a perilous state if we're pushed to have a second referendum. Now, I ideally hope that won't happen, but I think it was Nigel Farage that said, but if it does, we could very well find that it's a huge Leave majority, because what the British people have seen written all over this is betrayal. You know, if you're conspiring with an unelected foreign power to take over your country at a time when the people have said, we're out of there, what's the definition of that under English law? It's treason.
Didn't Tony Blair get rid of the treason laws?
Yes, he did. I mean, I'm not an expert lawyer, but yes, he made, yeah, I think that was probably foresight on his part.
Yeah.
But, you know, the British people are I mean, one of the things I've tried to do is to really speak this out in language that everybody can understand, because often it comes down to some very simple common denominators for people. If that document which I've described proves betrayal and treason going right back to 1971, and everything that's followed it, including our attempt to extract ourselves in 75, has been a cynical attempt to keep us into this thing that the EU has become, that I think people would be very angry, and they would say, actually, we need to know more. And the British people are traditionally, and I include in the British people all of us, you know, whether we're talking about Poles, Pakistanis, Indians, whoever they are, we are a fair people. But when we find out that we have been betrayed and duped, we get very angry.
Yeah. Talking of betrayal and treason, the police have even seen ahead prophetically a little bit and come out today and said basically that, can you make sure that you keep all your Brexit protestations friendly and nice and not over the top, because they can see that there's a feeling now, I believe, that they can see not far down the road could be the British version of the Gilets jaunes, where people have had enough and said, we've been duped, this duplicitous government, this duplicitous PM have really done one on us, and they can see violence. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but they can see it down the road. Got one here from William, from Bill Dean. Thanks, Bill. Greetings in the name of our great God and King. I've just watched the politics programme, and Olave read out Psalm 124, which the Lord had given regarding Brexit. My heart rejoiced when she read verse 7, which in the New King James says, our soul has escaped as a bird from the snare of the fowlers. The snare is broken, and we have escaped. I've shared that verse with others with reference to Brexit over recent weeks, and firmly believe, as Olave does, that the Lord is going to deliver us in spite of it being seemingly impossible due to the refusal of MPs to implement the referendum result. Yeah, I'm with you there, Bill. Parliament must remain sovereign, must decide on public expenditure and the deficit, and not the European Parliament. Why do we need a European army? Now we have some idea of the sovereign nations we colonised against their will, and that's from Ravi.
That's a very interesting comment. Well, of course, we're not sovereign now. We haven't been for a long time. This is an attempt agreed on by the people to wrest back our sovereignty, and you know, we've been in a situation for where the people have been duped for a very long time. I was just reminding myself of something that was said by Hitler's chief propagandist, Goebbels, and he said, if you tell a lie long enough, it becomes the truth. Tell a lie big enough, and people will eventually come to believe it. And I think that innocently, our people have for a long time believed the lie, because we've had our leaders telling us lies and we trusted them. So this is a betrayal of trust.
But it's happened on both sides. You know, this is part of the argument of why the Remainers want to say we want another referendum, because of all the things that were said in the beginning. Perhaps it was foolish to make some promises about the NHS and all of that money that would be saved. But it works both ways and on both sides. So it's knowing what is the truth, and that's why they want to, you know, we've had more time to discuss these issues, you know, and what it may lead to, the financial loss for every household and other people's businesses, that the loss of trade. What do you say about, what's your position on this? Because it is something that is a genuine concern for everybody. Sure, what do they do with regards to allaying their fears of us losing huge amounts of money, maybe for some years to come? It could be devastating.
I think it's a very difficult question, because whatever happens now, there are going to be economic and financial implications of it. It's inevitable. I think and I'm a businessman, and I believe earnestly that in whatever crisis befalls any nation, there's always business, there's always trade. Imagine what the effect would be, for example, of a loss of value, a further loss of value of sterling, if there was a withdrawal without agreement. Now, I think I'm right in saying it dropped 12% about against the US dollar right at the beginning of the process. What would that do? Well, I'll tell you what, it would make all my products cheaper for every German and American to buy. That's the positive side. And, you know, more knowledgeable economists than me would know all the detail of this, but quite frankly, many of the people that I've met and spoken to have said, you know, if this is the price that has to be paid to be a free nation again, I'm willing to pay it.
I think a lot of people are. That seems to be, you know, I don't think the people are sort of retracting their initial wish to come out because of the finances. I think they seem to be entrenched in still wanting to go ahead because they have great faith that our nation can and is very, you know, sort of competitive, but also very industrious. You know, we've done it for hundreds of years, quite successfully. But coming back to yesterday, because I didn't really get to bed till very, very early this morning, and I wasn't long before I was back in work again. What actually happened? We lost the ability to actually say we can come out with no deal. Is that?
I mean, it's fair to say that that Parliament had voted previously saying no to a no-deal Brexit. What that means politically is that our elected MPs voted against a law that they had passed. I mean, that's it. The law says we were to come out.
Right. So
they voted against themselves. It just shows what utter confusion there is.
And they've handed it now over to the House of Lords, but apparently the House of Lords, an unelected body, cannot rule on whether or not to accept what the House said yesterday.
Which is why so many are saying, the ones who are fully versed in the detailed machinations of our political system, they're saying this is an absolute crisis. There's been nothing like it in recent history.
Along these lines, Nick, Elizabeth says, I've come across from the English Democrats, I think that is the correct name, forgive me if I'm wrong, there appears to have been a legal challenge to the fact that the 29th of March was set in law as the Queen had signed it off. This was meant to have happened Tuesday or Wednesday. Do you have any further information?
Well, as I've just said, I'm not a politician, but it's clear what they've done. They've kicked the ball down the road first to April 12th. Now it could be kicked down into May.
And then even further.
And then perhaps further. They will do everything that they can to make sure that the democratic will of the British people, the majority, the 17.4 million, is not enacted. And that's how bad this is.
Right, emails, texts.
Yeah, here we go.
Coming in live at revelationtv.com.
Hi guys, brilliant show tonight. I'm just wondering how much of the disintegration of the Christian faith in the UK is the EU responsible for?
Well,
that's a wide-ranging question, isn't it, Nick?
That's a big one, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I happen to know David Hathaway, who I think he's been on these on your programmes in the past, an amazing international evangelist, and he made a film some years ago, if you remember, called The Rape of Europe.
That's right, we showed it.
And one of the things he showed is that the European Parliament building, I think it was in Strasbourg, is modelled on the Tower of Babel, which is the very symbol of man's rebellion against God. I think we, the believers in this nation, have got a great deal to answer for, because we've actually allowed... I mean, I would be one of the ones who said this battle's going to be won on our knees, in part because our weakness in reasserting the values which were Christian-derived in our nation has been one of the reasons why we're in the pickle we're in.
Yeah, totally.
Well, the scripture that comes to mind right there, because that symbolism which the EU has adopted over and over again with the unfinished tower as their place of being, and also the woman who rides the beast, all these things are coming out as symbolisms that are coming from Revelation, and the connotations are that they're demonic, the connection. But what about the scripture? Come out of her, my people, if you do not want to share with her sins. And he's talking about Babylon the Great, which is a greater, it's a more modern day equivalent to what Babylon was. And that represented confusion. It was the, if you like, the birth of all false religion, was it not?
It was indeed. And you know, if you look at some of the comments of the political leaders, if you think of Donald Tusk, saying, you know, there's a special place in hell reserved for you Brexiteers, effectively.
Amazing.
If you look, Michel Barnier was privately admitted that his mission would not be successful unless this was so painful for Britain that it deterred every other European nation from it. So there is a demonic aspect of it, that's for sure.
But they wouldn't recognise that.
No.
But the powers that be behind that would, because it's been part of the plan for the last at least 30, 40 years, is it not?
It has, and I mean, there are some, and I'm going to be careful with this because these are thoughts that people have that actually this European Union, not the European people, I stress, the European Union and the non-democracy that it is like the modern Roman Empire. And if you think back to your history, what was the farthest reach of the original Roman Empire?
Hadrian's Wall.
Well, actually, it's represented by Hadrian's Wall now. But in fact, the bit that they couldn't hang on to was Caledonia, called Scotland, because there was another wall, which was, I think, wood and earth, and that was the Antonine Wall. And it was the fact that the Roman Empire was in such a mess that meant they had to pull back. I think it was the 9th Legion and others periodically from Caledonia and the fiercely independent northern peoples. That meant that ultimately they couldn't defend it, and by 410 they had to withdraw. And I wonder if there's a repeat of this happening. I made a comment. It was an outtake. I did keep this particular clip where the child's father, the child that you saw in the film, was talking about, what had swung it, and was it the blue collar North, and I made the comment. I said, well, if you take the population of the whole of the island of Ireland, and you add it to the population of Wales, and you add it to the population of Scotland, you're about there with the number of northern people. And the northern people, if you think of the Jarrow marches and the history, are fiercely independent for the things of God. And one for the history books, for those who are interested, there was something called a Pilgrimage of Grace. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. No. Whoever wins the history, wins the battles, writes the history. Whoever wins, they write the history. So when Henry VIII had basically was sacking the monasteries and taking all the money, and he wanted his new religion. Do you know where the rebellion was? It was in the north, and in fact it was next to my village where it began. A man called Sir Francis Bigod, his family could trace their ancestry to the 22 surety barons who signed Magna Carta in 1215. He and a guy from Selby called Robert Aske basically rebelled against the king. They never drew blood, but what they did is they massed an army of 45,000 men who met in 1536 across the River Don from the king's men under the Duke of Norfolk. And they were so outnumbered that the king, basically, the representative of the king said, okay, guys, we give up. We don't want to, they were overwhelmed. Yorkshiremen, Lancastrians, Lincolnshire men, Cumbrian. And he said, well, we'll sue for peace. And so the Northerners went home because they'd won. There was going to be Parliament at York for the northern people, and no man born north of the River Trent would be tried in London. And what did the government of the day do? The king. Once it had been agreed and signed, he had, by God, taken away, hung, drawn and quartered, and basically sent teams in to get both Robert Aske from Orton, Selby, and by God, and had them killed. But there was an example of, a fiercely independent people saying, no, enough already. They didn't draw blood, they believed the promises that they were made. Again, they were betrayed.
Wow.
Emails, text?
Nick, question from me, just a quickie. You mentioned the Roman Empire there. A lot of people do believe that the European Union is the final world empire of Nebuchadnezzar's statue, the revived Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Well, they could very well be right, and I've studied this, and I would be one of the ones who thought we were in a particular part of history where that might be an interpretation that was valid. But you're speaking to a guy who is a businessman, a pragmatism. I have a strong life of faith, but I'm always trying to see a reflection in the natural of what is happening in the spiritual. And so I think that could very well be right. And so if that is true, wherever it leads us, it still leads us to a point where the battle is going to be won by individuals coming together on their knees to pray for a divine intervention, and at the same time asking the question, so what do I do about it?
Yeah.
Well, I know what I did about it. I'd spent about a week on a little island off Devon called Lundy Island, out of the world of business, just saying, I just need to hear what's going on. And I went, after coming back, I felt it was time to arise and speak out. And so I did what I could. There are thousands and thousands, there are millions of people like me who are praying for the right outcome here. And if they pray, and if they then ask for inspiration about what practical action they can take, for example, telling their MP that they will never, ever vote for him again unless he votes in accordance with their wishes, there are pragmatic solutions. There are things that people can actually do, which may well turn out to be part of the answer to their prayers.
Amen.
Do you know, I just got Revelation chapter 17 here. I thought, let me just have a look at what it says. And you know that wherever that statue is of the woman riding the beast,
yeah.
And it's, where is it? Is it in Strasbourg?
I think that's in Strasbourg, yeah, the stainless steel one, yeah.
Together with the way that they picked on using the same sort of unfinished tower.
Yeah.
Okay. And if you remember, the whole reason that they tried to build this was really more or less to give the finger to God, because they were going to be as great as God, and they wanted to build this tower as high as they could. And God caused the confusion because they all spoke one language at that time, and then they were confused because they couldn't understand. I mean, confusion's going to come again, and maybe what we're seeing. But let me read you chapter 17 here. It says, the doom of Babylon, because we remember I mentioned earlier that God warns us to come out of Babylon the Great. And we know it's an end-time prophecy because it's all about when Babylon falls in 1 hour. Yeah. Even the merchants, the people who do business, are astounded. It says they are aghast at what's going to happen because of what will happen to our political system, our financial system. Everything will collapse in 1 hour, and they will stand back aghast. But here, let me read you this. It says, the one of the seven, I'm reading from verse 1, the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and spoke with me, saying, come here, and I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. And he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on the scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and the woman who clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with the gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a gold cup full of abominations and of unclean things of her immorality. And on her forehead a name was written, the mother and the mystery, the Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And then it says, and I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, who were the witnesses of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered greatly. I mean, it starts to go on to say, really, basically, that they're going to wage war. We know that with the people who are of God. Christianity has become a really bad stench in their nostrils. And if you think about, and we've got to be very careful here, right? But when you think of all the laws that have been changed in our recent years, have all come mainly on moral issues.
Yes.
Have come from the EU.
Yeah.
Okay? And almost happened overnight. It's like it was just dictated, and everybody said, right, this is the way we're going to do. Everything else that was according to God's law was one way, and now they've changed it to another way. So it's like, what do you do? Where do we? I mean, I don't know about you, but as a Christian, I feel betrayed. I feel like persona non grata because we stand for God's moral laws, those that even affect us all. You know, we've got to have some standards, and it just seems that, you know, now we can see that we're going to be put in prison, We can see the things that we're being found guilty of, even preaching on the streets.
Yeah.
Even some of the things that we're doing that were for thousands of years were okay. Now we're the enemy.
Yes, I mean, the Christians, you know, they've got this in sharp focus. I mean, there are many who believe that if you're a believer, and particularly if you're a believer who understands God's eternal purposes for the, or thinks he does, God's eternal purposes for the Jewish people, you're going to be in a minority, and people are not going to like it. I want to just share something, if I may, which really took me down this track. Some years ago, this is pre-Brexit, I had a picture come into my mind. I'm not going to say any more than that. Just this thought came into my mind, and what I saw in my mind's eye looked like a satellite image of Europe. And Britain was attached to Europe. And I saw this huge sword come out of the sky. It had been a restrained hand, and then it was let go, and it cut through these huge cords. And they looked like ship's mooring ropes, the ones which would tie a ship to the harbour. And when I looked closely, not all the cords were cut. So I didn't know what that meant at the time. And then Brexit came. And I remember I was with my brother Paul. We were on an island called Islay, the Hebridean island, on the day of Brexit. And all the talk was Remain, Remain, Remain. And people were asking me, a bunch of non-Christians, you know, there was the instructor and there were a few Christians there. And people said, somebody said to me, so what do you think, Nick? I said, well, I'm not going to tell you what I think. I'm going to tell you what I know. When you wake up in the morning, the vote will be leave. And they were like, well, what? How could you possibly know that? And I shared the picture. And I said, now, tomorrow when you wake up, it will be leave. Then watch for the fudge, because I saw some cords still attaching us. Now, that's all I saw. But this, for me, has been entirely predictable. Now, I've got two really close friends, Sarah and Trevor Winbow. They're a lovely couple of biblical scholars and very wise prophetic people. And Sarah, she sent this to me, which I think sums up where we are and what is required of the believers if we're to get out of this ungodly mess. She says, in Exodus 19, 1-8, we see the Lord having done his bit, having brought the people out from under the yoke of Pharaoh. We believe that we're continuing to stand firm on this in prayer, whatever the circumstances may look like. He then goes on to challenge them how to do their part to be obedient and wholehearted to him. To this end, they made a covenant vow with him in verses 6-8. In relation to this and Brexit, we sense that God is sending an urgent call to those of us who take our own covenant relationship with God seriously to rise up together in obedience to what we believe to be God's heart in order to stand with him and his purposes for Israel and for our nation so that we can see the chain severed. They saw a chain prophetically, I saw cords. It's nothing less than an urgent call for the body of Christ to wake up and become truly earnest in prayer. We believe Brexit with no deal is God's heart. Now, that's their opinion. I tend to share it. An intention for our nation, but it may not happen unless the church prays. I'm sure the timing of all this happening as we approach the Jewish Passover season couldn't be more prophetically apt or obviously crucial for this nation's well-being. That's powerful.
Yeah. Do you know, I've got to read this as well, because I think the timing of this, I've never thought about it before, but I think it's apt that I read this scripture. This is carrying on from what I was saying before in chapter 17 of Revelation, going into chapter 18. It actually highlights, several times in these early passages in the first part of 18 about the sensuality, the immorality of these particular this group of people that are part of Babylon the Great, right? Well, I don't know whether that's the EU or whatever, but, let me just say, when it comes to verse 8, and do you know whose words are ringing in my ear? Barry Smith of this, okay? Because I used this particular phrase as a catchphrase on one of the intros I did back in 1996, I think it was. It says, for this reason, in one day, he was talking about Babylon the Great, right? Her plagues will come pestilence and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire, for the Lord God who judges her is strong. And the kings of the earth who committed acts of immorality and lived sensuously with her will weep and lament over her when they see the smoke burning, standing at a distance because of the fear of their torment, saying, Woe! Woe, the great city Babylon, the strong city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn over her, because one buys their cargo anymore. No one buys it. Cargoes of gold and silver and precious stones and pearls and fine linen and purple and silk and scarlet and every kind of citron wood, etc. It's talking about all the things that they traded with, right? And all of this will just come to an end in this 1 hour. But it's interesting for me when I read, while you were talking, these scriptures, it seems to be tied in with their immorality and their sensuality. Yeah. And we know over these last 5-10 years, it just seems that anything goes now, doesn't it?
Well, it does indeed. And I think of some of the people that I know who are Muslims, particularly Pakistanis, and they see, I mean, they have a very strong family value in terms of revering the young, you know, looking after the old, and they must look upon what happens on an English high street on a Friday and Saturday night in absolute disgust. What sort of, you know, when their parents came here, and now we're talking about British Asians, you know, who are they're English or as Scottish as any other, they see this and think, well, you know, what part of that is attractive? We are in that moment, and there's something I want to say here, which you won't get into trouble, but I might. But you know, that scripture about things coming to, you know, effectively coming to a sudden change in a day. To do with trade, to do with finance. Well, every man and woman in these islands, we've all had letters regularly from our financial authority, the FSA, basically saying this. And it's sort of supposed to be a wonderful comfort to us. You know, £85,000 of your money is guaranteed. I think it's 100,000 euros in Europe and maybe $100,000 in the States. Well, I'm a bit forensic when I start. I like the detail when I start to look at things. And I found a document which every one of your viewers could go online and find now. They just need to Google Bank of England FDIC, and they'll find a PDF. FDIC is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation in the States, and of course Bank of England is the Bank of England. And this is a document which was produced in 2012. And just as with Brexit and every other issue, they use jargonese and gobbledygook, so the ordinary man in the street won't know what it means. But they use a concept, an abbreviation called G-Sci-Fis. I mean, sci-fi, I thought that was, you know, Star Trek. But anyway, G-Sci-Fi is globally significant international financial institutions. And this goes on to describe the mechanism by which, in any future financial crisis, a too-big-to-fail bank going fail, there'll be no more government bailouts. Exactly. There'll be a bail-in. Yeah. And so they published that in December, and it shows how it even uses words like unsecured creditors, that's you and I with our money in a bank or building society, can expect their accounts to receive a haircut. Now, most of the viewers will not have 85,000 in their current accounts. That's not a problem, but, you know, even the small business, relatively speaking, that I have has an 8 million turnover. Now, what good's an 85,000 guarantee to me if somebody's just paid £300,000 for a product? So you can actually see how easily it would be in 1 hour. In 1 hour for it to happen. And that's further evidenced the following year by a document which the International Monetary Fund produced, which basically said 2008 hasn't gone away. There are 5 ways in history this ends, and it shows the 4 of them that are pretty awful. You know, hyperinflation, currency collapse, etc. One good one, economic growth. And it goes on to say, these views must not be taken to represent the official views of the IMF. It was a working paper, but the signature was the former chairman of the World Bank. Do you know when they published that? This is another rabbit hole moment.
2 or 3 years ago?
They published it in 2013, but they published it on Christmas Eve in the afternoon.
Yeah, so that nobody would read it.
So nobody would read it.
I was aware, and I have mentioned it to our viewers in recent years, the last couple of years, I think, that there is no longer any really guarantee of your deposit, because apparently there's a document that the bank sent out to everybody said that once the money basically is in their account, you are a creditor. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes. Well,
so they have the right to hang on to any amount.
Yes.
There's no guarantees whatsoever.
Well, that's been such a change, I think, ever since President Nixon in the 70s, I think he abolished the gold standard. Really, the currency's been, the value of currencies is all about confidence.
Yeah.
That's essentially...
And there isn't enough.
And, well, if confidence goes... I mean, I happen to be connected to someone who sadly now passed away, a great Christian and statesman who was connected to our government, and he found out that we were moments away, potentially, from the ATMs being switched off in 2008 temporarily. And can you imagine what chaos that would bring? I don't want to say that I think, you know, that's where we're headed, but that scripture's going to come to pass one day.
Yeah, in 1 hour. Yeah. You know, and all the trade and everything we do. But we'll all be in the same boat at that time anyway, is it? Or without it. Yeah. But coming back to something that you just to, well, first of all, we've probably got 2 minutes or something left, somebody tell me. And just, what would you say to our viewers right now? What hope do we have for those who voted to come out of the EU? Well, will that be successful?
We were just talking about money. What does it say on a pound? It says, I promise to pay the bearer on demand. There's nothing to pay with. What does it say on a dollar bill?
In God we trust.
They don't. But that's...
All others pay cash.
That's our... I once shared with a group of people a view on what I've just described about what might happen in the future. And people accepted it and said, you know, that's a real it's a viable argument, we can accept it. But what does it mean for me? And I said, the answer to that question, as a member of the body of Christ, as a believer, is as individual as you are, you need to take these things into your own prayer closet and say, what do I need to do? I personally believe that, you know, that we will prevail. But I do expect that in the process there'll be some pain, and I'm not one of the only ones who believes that. As for what will be the left and right turns, the ducks and dives that happen in the coming weeks and months, I wouldn't want to predict it, but the end outcome will be that our nation will come out from under the yoke of Babylon. That's what I believe.
Yeah. Actually, what Nick said at the start about, you know, the young lions and Tarshish, Derek Walker shares the same views, you know. President Trump and Brexit are God's last throws of grace at these two God-fearing nations, once God-fearing nations, that are actually going to enable us, possibly, to stand with the Jewish people at the end, because no one else will. Yeah. And so this is the last throw of grace. He's given us grace. Let's not waste it.
Absolutely. And I think it's fair to say that we need to be cautious as believers, as we're speaking to others who don't yet share the faith, who don't even understand some of the language we speak about, to speak in a language that they can understand. We might have the interpretation, we might have the understanding. When these crises come, we will be the light, effectively. Remember, there's a scripture that says, in those days and at that time, 10 men will clutch at the sleeve of one Jew, one Christian, let's say, and say, please, let us walk with you, because we believe God's with you. Those are the days, perhaps, into which we're heading.
Yeah. Well, we are coming to a close, and I want to thank you very much, Nick, for sharing with us, and we'd like to invite you back again if there's any time that you want to come and share with our viewers. Also to our viewers for writing in, and for Mark as well, reading out.
We could do 4 hours on this. It's just got no chance.
But, you know, the thing is that the Lord has made it possible for us to know the future. When we read His Word, we can see that it's all forming a pattern of where we are in the stream of time, and Christ is coming at the end of an age, and it could be that very age in this generation. So get into your Bible, read it for yourself, pray as well, pray for our country, because this is an opportunity for us to come out from under the clutches of those which we believe are quite demonic, and they will see it. But thank you very much. God bless you, and thanks for watching Q&A and Revelation TV. Good night.